And so the reason the names are given is because it's a way of saying to the people that Mark or Matthew or Luke or John are writing to, it's a way of saying to them, you know this person. If you want to know if this story is true, if you want the background information on this story that I'm telling you, you can go talk to them, because we know who they are. We have their names, and you know them. All right? Now that we know that, we're able to go to the Gospels and ask ourselves, how popular are the various names that appear in the Gospels and in the book of Acts? And we find that the popularity of various names in the Gospels and Acts, both male and female, coincides almost exactly with the popularity, with the comparative popularity of names that we know actually existed in first century Palestine. There's no way anybody anywhere in the Greco-Roman world who wanted to fabricate stories about Jesus could possibly have done that as precisely, to correspond as precisely with what was actually the case as what we see in the Gospels. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. In the last couple weeks, we've done kind of an abbreviated section on history, and we looked at just a number of, very briefly, we looked at a number of issues that come up when you're talking with people about Christianity, that come up in relationship to the subject of history. And so last week we looked at the question of orthodoxy, the origin of the Orthodox faith, whether or not there were multiple Christianities, that sort of thing. And then we looked at just a number of aspects of Christianity's influence on Western civilization throughout the centuries, particularly in the early centuries, but even up until today. So those sections on history then are a good segue into what we want to begin to talk about today as the beginning of our next module. So this module is on Jesus, and we're going to have several lessons, and we're going to talk about a number of questions that people have about Jesus. And the first have to do with just questions related to Jesus as a person in history. Okay, so that's what we want to talk about today. And I have a list here for you and in your notes on, again, a number of resources that are available. Lee Strobel has written a number of apologetic texts, books on apologetics, and this particular one, The Case for the Real Jesus, is really good, very readable, and talks about a number of the things we're going to talk about today. William Lane Craig, of course, we've talked about him many times before. He has a book, On Guard, which is kind of a general apologetics book, but it's written at a very popular level, very easy, relatively easy to read. And then, of course, his more advanced apologetic text, more at a college level, is Reasonable Faith. Richard Bauckham is a Scottish scholar, and he's done quite a bit of work on the historicity of the Gospels, the historicity of Jesus, and that sort of thing. And his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is really, really good. And we'll talk some more about him today. I've mentioned several times recently, I have mentioned the book In the Defense of the Bible, which is edited by Cohen and Wilder. And there's a chapter in there written by Paul Barnett on the historical reliability of the New Testament, particularly what we're thinking about today, of course, of the Gospels, but that's just a tremendous chapter and is very helpful. And then there's a fairly new book, came out a couple of years ago by Craig Keener. Keener is just a remarkable scholar. He's just an incredible researcher. He's written on just a number of different subjects. I have spoken before, and in a couple of weeks we'll mention him again. He's got a 2-volume work on the subject of miracles. It's just an amazing piece of work. He's written commentaries and that sort of thing. But he just recently, a couple of years ago, wrote the book Christobiography. Now, this happens to be a book I haven't read yet. In fact, I just got it. It's sitting right there by my computer saying, "Read me, read me." So it's one of the next books I'm going to read. But Keener just has a very good reputation as a researcher, and so I'm really looking forward to reading this book on the historical aspects about Jesus and that sort of thing. So if you read the book before I do, let me know what you think about it. Okay? So when you talk to people about Jesus, then there are oftentimes kind of the same questions. We get a number of questions, but they tend to be largely in the same area. And one of the first questions people want to know is, was he a real person? Okay, because there's a lot of people out there that think that Jesus is just this kind of made-up person, that the early Christians, the early church, just kind of fabricated this guy, or sometimes they think of him as maybe kind of a composite of a number of various mythologies that were in the Greco-Roman world at the time that just kind of got gathered together and into kind of a composite person that became this Jesus. So that's very common. Or oftentimes people think, well, yeah, there was a person there was a person in first century Palestine by the name of Jesus, but we really don't know anything about him. So all the stories and things we have about him are just legends and traditions and things like that eventually just kind of got added to this kind of very obscure person of Jesus of Nazareth. So we really don't know much about who the actual person was. So that's a question that oftentimes people have. And then on the other hand, people say, well, yeah, I believe there was a Jesus, and I believed he taught, he had disciples and that sort of thing. I believe it, but I just don't believe the miracles, okay? That the miracles are just too much. So did this Jesus really perform miracles? Did he really perform exorcisms and that sort of thing? And we'll be looking at it at some depth in a coming lesson here. And then the question is, oftentimes people will accept the fact that there really was a Jesus, and they may even accept that he was a miracle worker, or at least was a claim to be a miracle worker, and they'll acknowledge that. But they don't believe that Jesus really claimed to be the kind of things that you and I believe him to be, that he was the Messiah, that he was divine, those sorts of things. So they really wonder, why would you believe those things? So even if you can take them to passage in Scripture that we think Jesus is saying those things or implying those things, they just don't see that in those passages, and they don't understand why we do. So that's a question people often have. And then, as strange as it may seem, people who do believe that Jesus was an actual person, he actually lived, and he did many of the things that are true, they don't believe that he was really crucified. And particularly you'll encounter this with Muslims. Of course, most Muslims do not believe that Jesus was crucified. They have reasons for that. So was he really crucified at the hands of the Romans in about 30 AD or whatever? And then, of course, ultimately is the question about, did Jesus ever actually really rise from the dead? That's pretty far-fetched, isn't it? And a lot of people think that this idea of Jesus rising from the dead is a story that was just kind of attributed to Jesus, that was borrowed from the mystery religions that were quite common in the Greco-Roman world in the 2nd and 3rd century and that sort of thing. So that the people, as they're kind of accumulating and writing these stories down about Jesus, they're borrowing from these other religions. And one of the things they're borrowing is this idea of dying and rising gods. And so that's another question that you're very likely to encounter when you talk to people. So think about this. Say one of your children, for those of you who have children, say one of your children comes home from school or comes home from college, and they begin to talk to you about what they've heard at school or what they've heard from a friend or what they've read in a book about, say for example, the Roman god Mithras. So Mithras was one of these Mithraism was one of these Roman mystery religions or Greco-Roman mystery religions that was common in the Greco-Roman world in the 2nd and 3rd century and that sort of thing. And as the story goes, and say your child came to you and said to you, well, Mithras was born of a virgin. And not only that, Mithras was a great itinerant teacher that he walked about, he traveled about teaching people. Mithras was reported to have had 12 disciples. He promised his followers immortality. He sacrificed himself. He gave himself as a sacrifice for world peace. And then he was buried. After his sacrifice, he was buried in a tomb, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. Okay, before his death, he instituted a sacred meal or a ritual meal, kind of like the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper that Christians observe. And he was considered by his followers to be the Logos, the Word, the Redeemer, the Messiah. Okay, so if someone came to you and they said that, or if one of your children came home from school, or they had read a book or something that told about this mystery religion god of Mithras, if they say these things to you, if they bring this up to you, what is it they're really saying? Okay, what's really implied here is the story about Jesus really isn't unique. Okay, all these other religions had the same stories, and we don't believe them. Right? We understand that they're myth, so clearly the stories about Jesus fit into this same category of mythology, and we shouldn't believe them. And that raises a question about what is the most reasonable way to approach the gospel? So several weeks ago we had our module in which we had a number of lessons, several lessons on the Bible and the authority of the Bible and the credibility of the Bible and that sort of thing. And so today we're kind of focusing along the same lines, except today we're focused precisely on the Gospels themselves, the stories of Jesus. Okay, so that's what we're focused on today. And the question is, when we come to the Gospels, when we read these accounts of Jesus' life, what is the most reasonable, most rational way to approach those? So should they be approached with this kind of an overall disposition of skepticism? Okay, I don't believe them unless for some reason with one particular story or whatever I'm given some really good reason to believe it. But generally I have this attitude of skepticism. Or maybe somebody just has just kind of a neutral attitude. Well, I don't doubt them, but I don't necessarily believe them either. Now, you may not find many people that fit into this category. Most people will fit into one or the other of the other two categories, but you may encounter somebody who just is really not negative about the stories they read in the Gospels, but they don't believe them either. Okay? And then, of course, the other approach that someone could take is an assumption of truthfulness. Now, when I talk about an assumption of truthfulness, I mean they come to the Gospels and they basically just regard the Gospels as fairly reliable historical documents. Okay, so they may not believe all the theology you believe from the Gospels. They may not believe, for example, the claims of Jesus to be divine or Messiah or whatever. But in general, they believe that the Gospels represent a fairly accurate historical record about a person who lived and taught and did certain things and had a reputation for certain things in actual history. And so, is that a better approach, or is that the most rational or reasonable approach? And when we think about that, one of the things we should do is we need to just kind of go back and remember, well, what have we talked about in our previous lessons? So back when we did our module on the Bible, right? We talked about a number of things about the credibility and the historicity and that sort of thing of the Bible. So what are some of the things that we can remember about that as we think about this question of what's the best way to approach the Gospels? And of course, we saw in those lessons that we can have great confidence in the reliability of the text. That is, that the Bibles that we hold in our hand, the Bibles we read, that the text that we're reading accurately represents what the first authors actually wrote. Okay, so we saw we can have confidence in the text, and we also saw that we could have confidence in the content of the text. And we saw that we have great reason to have confidence that we have the right books, that the canon is the right selection of books, and that other books that people think ought to be part of our story of Jesus lack credibility for one reason or another. And then there, of course, we saw that there's a great deal of external support for the Bible. So there's external writings that support various things that we read about in the Gospels. And of course, there's just tremendous archaeological support for the historicity of the Gospels. And then we saw also, we looked at, and I gave you a handout on this, we saw that the New Testament is a particular type of genre. It's a particular style of literature referred to as Greco-Roman bio. So it fits within this kind of broad category of historical biography from the Greco-Roman era. Okay, so they had certain characteristics, and the Bible exhibits those characteristics as opposed to the genre of mythological literature or mythological stories. So there's a marked difference between, when you read the Gospel, there's a marked difference in just the style of literature and the way things are spoken, the ideas that are communicated. There's a marked difference between that and the kind of thing you encounter when you read mythology. And then there's what we talked about when we talked about the quest for the historical Jesus. We talked particularly about the third quest, or the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. So this would be Jewish scholars. They're not Christians, they're Jewish scholars, but they're Jewish scholars who study the first century era, the first century Palestine era, and they even study Jesus and the life of Jesus and the Gospels. And the striking thing about these Jewish scholars is when they read the Gospels, what they see is a very real person. Okay, they recognize that the Jesus represented in the Gospels was a real historical person. And one of the reasons for that is because they recognize that he really exhibits the characteristics of a first century Palestinian Jewish rabbi. Okay, so he exhibits the characteristics. He really comes across to them as a real person. And they even recognize that he made messianic claims. Of course, as Jews, they don't believe his messianic claims, but they recognize and acknowledge, yes, this man Jesus was a first century Jewish rabbi, and yes, when we see the things that he said, he really was claiming to be the Messiah. So these are all things, remember, we talked about several weeks ago. So when we remember those things, then it becomes clear that this kind of skeptical, I doubt it, or I doubt everything unless you can prove otherwise, this kind of skeptical approach isn't warranted for a number of reasons. One is, we know, of course, now that the New Testament was written before there was sufficient time for the history to be lost. So much of the Gospels was written beginning about 20 years after the life of Jesus, and in the next couple decades or so. And when you think about it, if you think back to things that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, in your life, or in history or whatever that you remember, you can remember them usually the big things fairly vividly, fairly clearly, right? So we have to keep in mind that this is when the Gospels were written. They were written fairly shortly after these events happened, within the first 2 or 3 or 4 decades after they happened. And so there just wasn't time for the history, the actual real history, to be lost, and for legends and mythologies and that sort of thing to develop. And then again, as I've already mentioned, the genre of the Gospels is just a different kind of genre. It's a different kind of literature than is the literature of mythology. In addition to that, we know that the Jews had methods by which they could be careful to preserve the transmission and guard the transmission of both their oral and their written traditions and history. Okay, so they had mechanisms in place to ensure that the things that were really important to them were transmitted accurately and faithfully. And of course, most of the writers of the New Testament, 3 of the 4 writers of the Gospels, were all Jews. So these mechanisms would have been in place as they wrote down these very important things that were important to them about this person Jesus and his life and ministry and that sort of thing. And in addition to that, when you think about the early church, there were aspects of the early church that also protected and guarded the transmission of the history of Jesus. So, for example, as I've said, the Gospels were written during the time of the lives of the eyewitnesses. So there were eyewitnesses alive after the Gospels were written and then began to be circulated throughout the church. There were still eyewitnesses out there who could say, yes, that's how I remember it, or no, that's not how it was. Okay? And so that was one of the things about the church that helped guard or protect the accurate transmission of the life of Jesus. And then the second aspect of the church is that in the early years you had the institution of apostolic authority in place. So Jesus commissioned his apostles, commissioned the disciples as his apostles, and he gave them the responsibility to convey his message, his life, and his message to subsequent generations of Christians, so to the Christians who would come after them. And they had the responsibility to communicate that, to communicate it accurately, and to make sure that it was preserved and protected. And so you have this institution of the apostles that's in place until after the completion of the New Testament. So the New Testament is completed before all the apostles have died. So the apostolic authority is in place in the church to safeguard the message and the story and the teachings of Jesus. And in addition to that, we know that just the New Testament just has a tremendous track record of historical reliability. So from external writings from outside of the Bible, Roman historians and Josephus and others, as well as archaeological discoveries and things like that, over and over again, these things lend support to or credibility to the historical reliability of the gospel. So this kind of skeptical, I doubt it, I'm just not going to believe it, attitude coming to the New Testament just simply isn't warranted. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that a person would have to believe all the things we believe theologically by faith. Okay, I'm not saying they have to believe that, but it isn't reasonable to come with this very skeptical, very negative approach to the Gospels as far as their historical reliability. And one of the things that comes into play as we look at the Gospels is something we talked about several weeks ago when we were talking about the Bible and the credibility of the Bible, is this thing called the criteria of authenticity or authenticity markers. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit several weeks ago. I want to elaborate on it a little bit more today. So when scholars who are studying the New Testament, now they might come, as we said, they might come with just kind of a general kind of acceptance or assumption that generally it's true. Maybe not in every point. They may not believe it's true in every point, but just generally they believe it's an accurate historical, relatively accurate historical record. But as they read through the Gospels, they may come across one of these, what we call criteria of authenticity or authenticity markers. Okay, and these are, as we said several weeks ago, these are things which enhance our confidence in the credibility of the text. So I may believe, when I'm reading the Bible or reading the Gospel, I may believe it's true, all right? But if I come across one of these criteria of authenticity, if I see one, it'll cause me to go, oh yeah, this really lends credibility to this, okay? So one of the things we have to keep in mind, though, about these markers of authenticity, and I'll describe them to you here in a minute, and list them and tell you what they are and describe them here in a minute. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that they are sufficient to increase our confidence in the credibility of the text. Okay? So they're sufficient to do that. But they are not necessary. You don't have to have them to believe the text, right? So they're not sufficient. So they are sufficient. So the presence of a marker is sufficient to enhance our confidence. So I may believe the text, but when I come across one of these markers, it causes me to have even greater confidence in the truthfulness of the particular story or incident that's being recorded. But they are not necessary, so I don't have to have one of these markers to believe that the text is credible. If I have just kind of a general understanding, the New Testament is a historically reliable document, and I'm reading some account or some story in the Gospels, I may, just because I have this kind of general assumption of truthfulness, I may go, I think this is probably true, right? And I may do that even if there are no markers. So I don't have to have one of these markers to believe that what's being said is true. It's just that if a marker is there, it helps. It gives me added confidence. So what scholars do then is they look at all these things we've talked about. They look at archaeology, they look at external writings, they look at a number of different things, and along with those they also see these various markers of authenticity. And all these things together then help increase our confidence in the historical authenticity of the stories of Jesus in the Gospels. So what are these markers that we talked about? Well, the first one is what we call historical fit. And what that means is that in reading an account or an incident, when we read it, we recognize that it fits with what we know about that time, the first century, okay? It fits with what we know about the Greco-Roman world. And it fits with the place. It fits with, for example, first century Palestine. So it may make some geographical or topographical description or whatever. And we read that and go, yeah, that fits with what we know about the place. Or it may say something about the culture or the mindset of people. And well, yes, that fits with what we know about how people thought or what the culture was during the first century in Palestine. So historical fit is important. Second one is independent early sources. So if you're reading something in the Gospels and scholars recognize that there are multiple accounts of this from different sources. So Mark may be reporting it, but he's reporting it from one source, and Matthew may be reporting it, but he's reporting it from another source, that sort of thing. Now, clearly, there are places where it seems Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly depended on one another, but there are other places where they're talking about the same event, but they really seem to be drawing on different sources. So independent sources that are located in time, apparently quite close to when the event. If you come across that in the text, that enhances your confidence in the text. And then we talked about this, the element of embarrassment. So there are things in the Gospels that just seem to be kind of embarrassing. And you would think, why would somebody who was if they were just making this story up, why would they include these embarrassing things? So for example, the story of Peter's denials of Jesus. So if somebody in the early church, if these things really didn't happen, and somebody in their church was just kind of making stories up about Jesus and about the circumstances around his death and that sort of thing, why would they make up a story that put one of the primary leaders of the early church in such a negative light? Okay. So that's one of the things that makes you think, well, this probably really happened, because somebody just kind of making things up probably wouldn't make this up, because it wouldn't serve their purpose of increasing people's confidence in the leaders of the church. And then there's what's called dissimilarity, the marker of dissimilarity. And what we mean by that is that there may be an incident, or there may be a teaching of Jesus, or something that's in the Gospels, but we know that people didn't think that way, or we know things didn't happen that way in the first century. So they normally happen that way in the first century. And so if we detect things like these kind of dissimilarity issues, that can also make you think, okay, it probably really happened, because somebody writing then wouldn't have thought that way. They wouldn't have made that kind of thing up. So a great example of that is the resurrection itself. Okay, so there were no Jews in first, and we'll talk about this when we get to our resurrection module. There were no Jews in first century Palestine who believed in an immediate resurrection. So there were some Jews who didn't believe in resurrection at all, okay, and then there were Jews who believed in resurrection, but as we can see from the story of the raising of Lazarus, those Jews who believed in a resurrection believed there would be a resurrection at the end of the age and not before then, which is why they didn't believe that Lazarus would rise from the dead, right? So first century Jews did not think in terms of an immediate, present, nowadays, today, resurrection. So it's highly unlikely, if somebody was just making up stories about Jesus, that they would have imagined that, if they were a Jew, that they would have imagined that kind of thing, because that's just not the way Jews thought. It's just too dissimilar from thought. Another example is Jesus' use of the term Son of Man. It turns out, if you read through particularly the first three, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as you read through those and you think about those, over and over and over again, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. It's the most common way that Jesus refers to himself. Now, next week we're going to talk about the significance of that and what that meant. But particularly what I want to point out to you today is that over and over and over again in the Gospels you see that term, the Son of Man. And Jesus using that term to refer to himself, right? But once you get beyond the New Testament era into the early church, nobody uses that phrase. So you don't come across it a bunch in the writings of the church fathers. It's just not a way that the early church thought about Jesus. So they'll oftentimes talk about him as the Son of God. We do that even today. We talk frequently about Jesus being the Son of God. We very seldom talk about him being the Son of Man. So it's highly unlikely that some Christian, if Jesus really didn't live or didn't talk this way, it's really unlikely that some Christian just making up stories about Jesus would have repeatedly, over and over and over and over again, put these words on Jesus' lips, because that just is not the way people in the 2nd and 3rd century, Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, thought about Jesus. Another thing is what is called Semitism. You and I wouldn't pick up on these because we're not Greek scholars or Semitic language scholars, but those who are, when they read the Greek versions and the Greek manuscripts of the Gospels, one of the things they detect, one of the things they see, is Hebrewisms or Aramaicisms that are kind of hidden back there in the Greek text. But as you read the Greek, you see the Hebrew or the Aramaic that's kind of hidden back there in it, which reflects that kind of that very Jewish origin of these ideas. And then there is coherence. So if I read a story about Jesus, and if I see that way of representing Jesus really fits with other things I already know about Jesus from other places, okay? So the coherence of the story of Jesus is another criteria of authenticity or marker of authenticity. So these are just some of the things that scholars notice that give them added incentive to believe the text, to believe the historicity, the historical accuracy of the story. So let's go on now and talk about the this idea of Jesus as kind of a copycat, that the early church was just, Jesus, if he ever existed, he wasn't really this way, that these are just ideas that were just kind of superimposed on this Jesus, or this Jesus was made up out of whole cloth, using kind of this composite view that's gathered from all these other religions that were popular in the Greco-Roman world. And of course the claim is that this is what happened, that Christianity borrowed from these other religions to construct the Jesus that we read in the Gospels. So oftentimes you'll hear people talk about, in the mythology, you get this idea of the dying and rising gods, and you get the idea of virgin births, and you get other key events in the life of Jesus that are supposedly seen in these mythologies. And so the idea, of course, is that the church borrowed those. Now, on this question about the dying and rising gods, I'm not going to deal with that today, because we're going to deal with that when we get to the module on the resurrection. So we'll deal with that particular aspect later, but the rest of them we'll talk about now. So the question is, how do historical scholars, how do the people who really know the history and know the historical documents about Jesus and about first century Palestine and about the Greco-Roman world, how do they view this idea that Jesus is just kind of a borrowed story? And as it turns out, from about the latter part of the 19th century up to about the middle or so of the 20th century, this really was kind of oftentimes scholars really did embrace this idea that Jesus was kind of a copycat, all right? Or the stories of Jesus are a copycat. But today, with modern scholarship, that idea about Jesus is almost universally rejected, okay? They believe that these stories are rooted in some kind of substantial history. They are not just borrowed, okay? And even though that's true with most scholars, it's still a very common idea you'll run into with just common people. So just the average Joe on the street, or somebody just writing at the popular level who's really not a scholar on the subject, whether it's Dan Brown or whatever, may represent this idea of Jesus, okay? But scholars today, in large measure, just don't give it any weight. And the question would be then, well, why do scholars reject this idea about Jesus? And there are actually a number of reasons. I've got 8 reasons that I've listed here, and we'll go over them. There are just a number of reasons why modern contemporary scholars reject this idea that Jesus is just borrowed from the neighboring religions. So the first reason is that actually the whole argument is based on a logical fallacy. So it's a logical fallacy to claim that just because two things are similar, one caused the other, right? So the way philosophers and logicians often express it, correlation does not imply causation. So if you have two things that are similar, unless you have some kind of evidence or reason beyond that to know that one caused the other, just the fact that they are similar does not mean that one caused the other. So correlation does not imply causation. So to whatever degree there is similarity between some of the myths and the stories of Jesus, to whatever degree there is similarity, there's no reason to necessarily believe, unless you have some other evidence, there's no reason to believe that one caused the other or that one grew out of the other. Okay? The second problem that scholars recognize is that the chronology just seems to be wrong. So when these mystery religions really began to get traction in the Greco-Roman world, really starts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But we know that the Gospels were written, and in fact the entire New Testament was written in the 1st century, right? So how is it possible that something written in the 1st century could have borrowed from something that really didn't develop and become influential until the 2nd century or the 3rd century? Okay? So for example, Mithraism. Now we know that the god Mithras and the whole religion of Mithraism is actually an ancient Persian religion, ancient Persian myth. Okay? But we also know that it didn't really come to the fore in the Greco-Roman world until the 2nd century AD. Right? So it didn't come to the fore until after Christianity was already on the ground and running. And it basically came in through the Roman legions, through the Roman armies. So that's how and it was really quite popular among the among the Roman legions. But again, it comes really after the Christian era is already well underway. A third thing is that scholars recognize is that Paul was a Jew, and not only was he a Jew, but he was a former Pharisee. And so in Paul's frame of mind, it would have just been anathema, really anathema, to incorporate other pagan religions into his religion. And of course, he wrote a great deal of the New Testament. And much of our understanding of Jesus, of course, comes from Paul. So it's just almost impossible to conceive that someone like Paul would have been borrowing from other religions to construct his view of Jesus. And along the same lines, when we think about the earliest Christians, we know that they were very exclusivistic. Okay, so any idea of syncretism with other religions was just, again, it was just anathema to the early church. It would have been immediately just rejected. And one of the most clear evidences of that we have is that thousands of Christians died because they refused to incorporate the ideas of other religions into their Christian faith. So particularly, we know that Caesar insisted that all people in the Roman Empire acknowledge him as Lord. Caesar is Lord. They just wanted him to say Caesar is Lord. They weren't saying that you couldn't say your God was Lord, and they weren't saying that you had to say you had to renounce Jesus as Lord. All you had to do was just add Caesar to your pantheon of gods, whatever that was. So Christians didn't have to renounce Jesus as Lord. All they had to do was acknowledge Caesar as Lord. Of course, to Christians, we recognize that is renouncing Jesus, but in the context of the time, that's all they had to do. And Christians refused to do that and went to their deaths because they refused to do that. It's very hard to understand how Christians would have been so amiable to the idea of just borrowing from other religions and bringing that in and making that a part of their Christian faith. The fifth point is that unlike the myths, what scholars recognize is that Christianity is grounded in history. We've talked about this a lot throughout the year, how the Christian faith is rooted in its historical claims. This is just not true about mythology. Mythology doesn't base its truthfulness on the truthfulness of any kind of historic claims. Okay, so there is, as we saw, this marked distinction then between historical literature and mythological literature, right? Or the historical genre and the mythological genre of literature. But even if there are similarities at various points, even if there were some similarities at various points with mythology, the mythology is mythology. The stories of Jesus are historical. So even if there's a similarity, the mythology remains mythology, but the things about Jesus are rooted in historical fact. Right? So the things about Jesus are still true because they're historically true, right? And so we just need to keep that in mind. Again, scholars recognize also that because many of these mystery religions postdate Christianity, if there's borrowing, it's most likely to have gone the other way. Now again, we don't have real evidence one way or another. So remembering the logical fallacy point 1 we talked about, we don't want to make any conclusions, but if there was borrowing, it seems like it's most likely that it was the mythologies, it was these other religions that were borrowing from Christianity rather than the other way around. The seventh point is that even though oftentimes people try to make this parallel between the dying and rising gods in mythology and the resurrection of Jesus. Scholars recognize they're just two different animals, so to speak. They're just two entirely different things. The resurrection of Jesus has just entirely different characteristics than these dying and rising gods that we see in the mythology. And we'll talk about that, as I said, when we get to that. And then the final point is that scholars just recognize that all these claims about similarity with Christianity just aren't true. Okay, so most of these alleged similarities that are made between these various religions, whether it's Mithraism or about the god Osiris or whatever, that most of these similarities are just completely fabricated by people who are just trying to discount Christianity, or they're exaggerated, or in some ways, even if they exist, their existence is irrelevant, it's insignificant. So, for example, with Mithras, was he born of a virgin? Well, no. Mithras emerged out of a rock. It's not quite a virgin birth, right? So there's no virgin birth there. He emerged out of a rock, fully developed. He didn't come out as a child. Was he born in a cave? Well, no. There's no record in the mythology of his being born in a cave. But further, the idea of being born in a cave really has no parallel with Christianity, because of course in the 2nd and 3rd century some Christians thought that Jesus had been born in a cave, but of course the Bible doesn't tell us that, does it? It doesn't tell us exactly where he's born. It doesn't even really tell us he was born in a stable. We often think of him being born in a stable, but it doesn't really say that he was, but it certainly doesn't say he was born in a cave. Mithras supposedly sacrificed himself for world peace, we're told, but in reality, no. He didn't sacrifice himself. He is reported to have sacrificed a bull, but this whole idea of world peace is completely foreign to mythology. So the pagan religions really have no concept of this idea of world peace. That is a Christian concept. So the idea of reading this idea of world peace back into these other religions is actually it's an anachronism. It's reading a Christian concept into these other religions that just simply wasn't there. Further, the claim is that Mithras was this great itinerant preacher, that he walked about on earth and he talked, and he had 12 followers and that sort of thing. And again, this just simply isn't true. He was a god. He wasn't a man. There's no record of him being a teacher. There's nothing in the stories of Mithras that represent him as this kind of itinerant teacher. Did he promise immortality? Well, on that we could say, so what? Virtually every religion, almost every religion, promises some form of immortality, right? So the fact that these other religions did really has no bearing on Christianity. That's a common feature of most religions. Was he buried in a tomb and raised 3 days later? Well, in fact, there's really nothing said in the Mithras literature. There's really nothing said about his death. So since there's nothing said about his death, obviously there's nothing said about how he was buried, and of course there's nothing said about him raising from the dead. Did he institute a Eucharist or a Lord's Supper? Well, even if he did, again, that's insignificant. Almost all religions have some kind of important ritual meal or spiritual meal, something that could be made in some way in people's minds parallel to our Lord's Supper or the communion, right? But other than that, or in addition to that, we recognize what is the origin of the Lord's Supper? What is the origin of what the Catholics call the Eucharist? Okay, this sacred meal or ritual meal that we engage in as Christians. What is the origin of that? The origin of that is in an actual, what we know of as a historical meal. Its origin is in the Passover supper, right? So it was at the Passover supper that this meal of Christians was initiated or begun. So we know that our Lord's Supper doesn't develop. We don't have the Lord's Supper because we borrowed it from mythology. We have the Lord's Supper because it's an outgrowth of what the Jews did for thousands of years. Historically, we know they did it, and they do it even today. And we know that the Lord's Supper was an outgrowth or a development from that. Was he considered the Logos, the Redeemer, the Messiah, that sort of thing? And the answer is just simply no. Those are just all things that people are projecting back into the Mithraism literature that really isn't there. They're borrowing again from Christianity and projecting it back into Mithraism. So these are just some of the reasons why scholars just no longer hold to any degree credible this idea that Christianity is just borrowed from, or is an amalgamation of, or a compilation of these other religions, just kind of all mixed together and developed into Christianity by somebody writing a century or two after the actual life of Jesus, if he really lived. Okay, so this is why scholars reject that. Now, there are a couple other developments in scholarship about the Gospels in recent years that I find particularly fascinating. I enjoy thinking about them, and both of them happen to relate to the issue of the names that we encounter in the Gospels. So the first development has to do with why certain people are named in the Gospels that normally we wouldn't expect to be named. Okay, so why are some less significant people in the gospel named while most of them are not? And then the second thing has to do with what we can learn from the frequency in which various names occur. So, for example, you have several Simons in the gospel, you have several Marys in the gospel, you have several Josephs in the gospel, that sort of thing. So what can we learn from that? So there have been some developments in this area in recent years. So when you think about people in the Gospels, you can think of them in kind of two groups. All right. So the first group would be people whom you would expect the author of the Gospels or the person recording the story would want to name. They're people that it would be most reasonable for them to tell us their name. So of course, clearly, the disciples. They're just very, they play a major role in the story. They keep individuals among the disciples keep coming up over and over again in the story. So it makes sense that they would be named. Important women in the story. So there are certain women in the Gospels who play a very important role, like the women at the tomb and that sort of thing. So it would be reasonable to expect that they would be named. And of course, then there are public figures that everybody would know and identify with. So Caesar, or Pilate, or Herod. Okay, these are all people that would fit in this first category that you would expect to be named. And then of course, whenever they're referring to Old Testament figures or genealogies, you would expect them to give us the name. But then you have this kind of second category. And the second category would be what we might think of as lesser characters. So these are people, for example, that Jesus might have encountered only once. So I have several examples for you there in your notes. The centurion there in Matthew chapter 8. The paralytic in Mark, remember, that's lowered down through the roof. It's really a kind of a fun story. All of us learned it in Sunday school when we were just little children, but we don't know the name of that fellow. Okay, it's just a one-time experience with Jesus, and we don't know the name. The demoniac, the Gerasene demoniac, the story of the demons being cast into the swine. Okay, a one-time encounter. He doesn't come back in the story at any point. We don't know his name. In John, the story of the little boy with the loaves and the fishes, from which Jesus then fed the thousands. Okay, a wonderful story, but the boy just appears on the scene and he's gone and he doesn't return. We don't know his name. Right? So this would be group 2. So these would be. For example, in most cases, if Jesus just healed a person, he just had one encounter with him, there was no further interaction, they would fit into that group. And what's significant about this group is that most of the people in this group remain unnamed. So we don't know who they were. We don't get the name, as I pointed out. And Richard Bauckham, who I referred to earlier, says this in his book on Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He says, the material common to the three synoptic gospels, therefore, shows an unambiguous tendency towards the elimination of names. In other words, what he's saying is that the gospel writers showed a tendency that if they could avoid giving the name, they would avoid giving the name. If it didn't serve some other purpose, they would avoid giving the name. So what that means is, within this second group of people that we encounter in the Gospels, when a gospel writer identifies somebody in that group by name, then they must have had some reason for doing so, because they didn't normally do that. Right? So we do get some occasions of people in the second group, what we would think of as in the second group, who fall into this category, the second group, but whom the various gospel writers name. So for example, in Mark, we have the story of blind Bartimaeus, and it names Bartimaeus, although we have no more encounters with him. There's the story of Jairus, whose daughter Jesus healed. There's the story of Simon the leper in Matthew, and there's the story of Malchus, the slave, who Peter cut off his ear. And these are people who really have no reason to know their name, it appears, and yet their name is given. And one of the more interesting ones is the story of Simon, who of course was the Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross. Okay, so this one-time encounter, he just carried the cross, he disappears, and we don't know any more about him, all right? But Mark tells us what his name is. But what's striking is Mark not only tells us his name, but he tells us the names of his sons. So he tells us that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. He says the father of Rufus and Alexander. Right? So why was Simon mentioned? And even more curious is, why were Simon's sons mentioned by Mark? Well, it's interesting because when you go further in the New Testament and we get to the book of Romans, you read through the book of Romans, you get to the end there in chapter 16 where Paul is going through all these lists of names of people greeting one another and all that sort of thing, and we tend to kind of skip through that part because it doesn't seem very interesting. But at one point he refers to Rufus, and most commentators believe that this is the same Rufus who was the son of Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus. So what Bauckham is pointing out here, what he's arguing, is that the best explanation for this kind of unusual naming of people in this second group that typically wouldn't be named, is that the people to whom he's writing, the church to whom the various gospel writers are writing, knew these people by name. Right? They knew Malchus. They knew Simon. They knew Simon's sons. Right? And so the reason the names are given is because it's a way of saying to the people that Mark or Matthew or Luke or John are writing to, it's a way of saying to them, you know this person. If you want to know if this story is true, if you want the background information on this story that I'm telling you, you can go talk to them, because we know who they are. We have their names, and you know them. All right? So it's very likely then that in this second group, this second category of people who aren't normally named, the ones who are named because they can provide eyewitness testimony to what the author is writing about. So it's just a very fascinating aspect of the Gospels that you may never have ever given any thought to. And then there's the issue of the frequency of the Gospels, and the frequency of names in the Gospels. And we have a Jewish scholar to thank for this, a woman, I think you pronounce that Tal Ilan, who was a Jewish scholar, who in 2002 published a database of every known Jewish name from every name of a person, a Jewish person, from 300 BC to 200 AD, over a period of 500 years, okay? And she gathered this information from all kinds of sources. So she gathered it from archaeological sources, she gathered it from Josephus, the writings of Josephus, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, she gathered it, of course, from the New Testament documents, she gathered it from documents from Masada, from Osiri inscriptions, from various legal documents, from early rabbinic sources. So she just used everything she could get her hands on that gave the name of somebody. She compiled those names and made a database of them. So what that means is that now, for the first time in history, now we are able to know the relevant popularity of every Jewish name in first century Palestine. So we know now which was the most popular male name. We know now which was the second most popular male name. We know now what was the third most popular male name. And the same is true with female names. We know the most popular, the second most popular, the third most popular, that sort of thing. So we know now, for example, that Simon or Simeon was the most popular male name in first century Palestine. And we know that Mary was the most popular female name. So you may wonder why, when you read the story of the women going to the tomb, you keep coming across these various Marys. Well, the reason is it was the most common name. You may wonder why, when you read the Gospels, you keep coming across somebody named Simeon or Simon. And the reason is it was the most popular name, male name, in first century Palestine. So what's interesting, though, is now that we know that about first century Palestine, now that we know that, we're able to go to the Gospels and ask ourselves, how popular are the various names that appear in the Gospels and in the book of Acts? And we find that the popularity of various names in the Gospels and Acts, both male and female, coincides almost exactly with the popularity, with the comparative popularity of names that we know actually existed in first century Palestine. So we have, for example, we have, I think, 8 Simeons or Simons in the Gospels, and of course, like I say, that's the most popular. And then you have several Josephs in the Gospels. And there again, that's the second most popular male name. You have a number of Marys in the Gospels, and that again, more than any other name any other female name in the Gospels. And so what's striking about this is this information that we have now about the Gospels and the relative popularity of the names in the Gospels. There's no way anybody in the first, second, or third century could have known that about first century Palestine. They didn't have what we have. They didn't have birth certificates. They don't have computers. They didn't have file cabinets full of the birth records of all these people and the naming. There's just no way that anybody who wanted to fabricate stories about Jesus and the people Jesus encountered and the people who followed Jesus, there's no way anybody anywhere in the Greco-Roman world who wanted to fabricate stories about Jesus could possibly have done that to correspond as precisely with what was actually the case as what we see in the Gospels. So this very close correlation of the frequency of particular names in the New Testament with what we now know is the comparative popularity of names in Palestine almost certainly could only be accomplished by somebody who was accurately, truthfully recording these various incidents and the actual people who Jesus encountered. So we can have tremendous confidence in the New Testament. We can approach the New Testament, and particularly the Gospels, we can approach them with great confidence. We know with almost absolute certainty that the stories of Jesus are not borrowed from other religions. We we know that we have a historically reliable account of Jesus about a man who really did live in first century Palestine, and we can know with real confidence about many things that he did. We know that he went about teaching, that he had disciples. We know that many people reported, whether you believe or not, we know that many people reported that he did miracles for them and even exorcisms. We know that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Some historians have said the crucifixion of Jesus, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, the crucifixion of Jesus is the most certain thing we have anywhere from ancient history. We know that he claimed certain things about God and about himself, and we'll talk about those next week. And we know we can have confidence in the records of his fate, again, that he was crucified as the Gospels record. And even the story of his resurrection, we can have confidence that at least we know that there were a number of people who reported having seen Jesus alive after his death. So these are the kind of things that we can have tremendous confidence in, and we can encourage other people to embrace the New Testament as a very accurate, reliable historical document. So next week, we'll go on then, and we're going to ask ourselves, okay, so there's this Jesus, and all these things are reported about him, but who was he? And most importantly, what did Jesus claim about himself? Do we have reason to believe that he actually did claim the things we say he believed? And how do we know that? And how can we show to other people that Jesus really did believe those things and claim those things about himself? So that's what we'll do next week. So, okay? See you all next week.